The smell of burnt toast clung to her fingers as Emilia Harper rushed out of the diner, tugging her threadbare jacket tighter against the bitter wind. The early spring air carried the promise of rain, but she had no time to care. She was already late for her shift at the bookstore across town, and the extra hours at the diner were barely enough to cover rent. Life, as usual, had her cornered. As she turned the corner, her sneakers skidding slightly on the wet pavement, she collided with a wall of muscle. The force sent her stumbling back, her tips spilling from her pocket and clattering onto the sidewalk. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry," she stammered, crouching down to retrieve the coins. "No, it's my fault. Are you okay?" The voice was deep, smooth, and oddly familiar. Emilia looked up, and her heart stopped. Standing above her was a man whose face she'd know anywhere, even after a decade. Dark, tousled hair, piercing gray eyes, a jawline that could have been chiseled from stone. It was him. "Caleb?" she breathed, disbelief flooding her voice. His brows furrowed for a split second, and then recognition dawned. "Emmy?" A slow, disbelieving smile spread across his face. "I can't believe this. It's been, what, 10 years? 12, she corrected, her voice barely above a whisper. 12 years since he and his family had packed up and left their sleepy little town without so much as a goodbye. 12 years since she'd lost her best friend, and the first boy she'd ever loved. He crouched down to help her gather the fallen coins. "I never thought I'd run into you here. What are you doing in the city?" "Working," she said, simply stuffing the coins back into her pocket. "And you?" "Just business," he replied vaguely, standing up and offering her a hand. His grip was warm, firm, and for a moment, she felt like she was 13 again, sneaking out to meet him by the old oak tree behind her house. "Well, it was nice seeing you," she said stiffly, brushing off her jeans. She didn't have time for nostalgia or the ache in her chest that his sudden reappearance had stirred. "Wait," he said, stepping in front of her as she tried to walk away. "Let me buy you coffee. Catch up. For old time's sake." She hesitated, glancing at her watch. She was already late, and her boss would probably dock her pay. But then she looked at him. The boy who used to climb trees with her, who once bandaged her scraped knee with his shirt, who had been her entire world before he vanished. "Okay," she said softly. The cafe was small and cozy, a stark contrast to the sleek, impersonal atmosphere of the city outside. Caleb ordered for both of them. Black coffee for himself, a caramel latte for her, just how she used to like it. "So," he began once they were seated, "tell me everything. What's been going on in your life?" She shrugged, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Not much to tell. I work 2 jobs, live in a shoebox apartment, and try not to burn toast every morning. You know, the usual." His smile faltered, but he quickly masked it. "You always were modest. I bet you're doing better than you let on," she snorted. "Trust me, I'm exactly as boring as I sound. What about you? What kind of business are you in?" "Real estate," he said after a pause. "It keeps me busy." She raised an eyebrow. "That's vague." He laughed, and the sound was warm and familiar, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Let's just say I've been lucky. A few good investments, and things kind of took off." "Well, good for you," she said, forcing a smile. She didn't want to pry, but something about his evasiveness nagged at her. As they talked, the years seemed to melt away. They laughed about childhood mishaps, reminisced about their old neighborhood, and shared stories of where life had taken them. But beneath the surface, Emilia couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb was holding something back. When the conversation finally lulled, he leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Emmy, I know I disappeared on you, and I'm sorry. I should have reached out, but things were complicated. I didn't know how." She looked away, her throat tightening. "It doesn't matter. That was a long time ago." "It matters to me," he said quietly. His words hung between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from her boss, demanding to know where she was. "I have to go," she said, standing abruptly. "Let me walk you," Caleb offered, but she shook her head. "No, it's fine. Thanks for the coffee." And with that, she left, her heart pounding in her chest and her mind spinning with questions. As she walked to the bookstore, she couldn't stop replaying their conversation in her head. Caleb had always been her safe haven, her partner in crime. But now he felt like a stranger with secrets. And yet, against all logic, she found herself hoping she'd see him again. The bell above the bookstore door jingled as Emilia stepped inside, the warmth of the shop enveloping her like a comforting hug. She quickly tied on her apron, her manager glaring at her from behind the counter. "You're late," he grumbled, not even looking up from his clipboard. "I know, I'm sorry," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear and hurrying to organize the display table. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, still stuck on Caleb's face, his voice, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only person in the room. She hated how easily he still got under her skin, even after all these years. By the time her shift ended, the rain outside had turned into a full-blown downpour. Emilia sighed, tugging her hood over her head and bracing herself for the cold, wet walk home. But as she stepped outside, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The passenger window rolled down, and there he was. Caleb, leaning casually against the leather seat, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain. "Need a ride?" he asked, a mischievous smile playing on his lips. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What are you doing here?" "You mentioned you work here," he said simply. "Thought I'd check in. And save you from walking in this weather." Emilia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to say no, but the thought of trudging home in the rain and the fact that she couldn't seem to resist him won out. "Fine," she said, climbing into the car. The interior was warm, the leather seats buttery soft. It smelled faintly of cedar and something distinctly Caleb. "Nice car," she muttered, running her fingers over the dashboard. He chuckled. "It gets me where I need to go." They drove in silence for a few minutes, the city lights blurring together through the rain-streaked windows. Emilia couldn't help but notice how effortlessly he navigated the streets, like he belonged here in a way she never had. "So," she said finally, breaking the silence, "what's the real reason you're here? You don't just show up at someone's job out of the blue." "I wanted to see you again," he admitted, glancing at her as they stopped at a red light. His voice was soft, almost vulnerable. Her stomach flipped, but she forced herself to stay guarded. "Why?" "You disappeared for 12 years, Caleb. You don't get to just waltz back into my life like nothing happened." "You're right," he said, his jaw tightening. "And I'm sorry for that. But I never stopped thinking about you, Emmy. Not once." She turned to him, her chest tightening. "Then why did you leave? Why didn't you call or write or—" "It's complicated," he interrupted, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "But I promise you I had my reasons. I couldn't stay." Before she could press him further, the car came to a stop in front of her apartment building, a crumbling, paint-peeling mess that looked even worse in the rain. She cringed, suddenly painfully aware of the stark contrast between his world and hers. "Thanks for the ride," she said quickly, reaching for the door handle. "Wait," he said, his voice firm. She paused, looking back at him. "Have dinner with me," he said, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "What?" she asked, caught off guard. "Dinner. Tomorrow night," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let me make it up to you." She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him that she didn't have time for fancy dinners or second chances. But the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing that mattered, made her resolve crumble. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. "I'll pick you up at 7. As she stepped out of the car and into the rain, She could feel his eyes on her until she disappeared inside. Her heart raced as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, her mind spinning with questions. What was she doing? What did he want from her? She didn't have answers. All she had was the memory of his smile and the way it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. The next evening, Emilia stood in front of her tiny mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. She'd borrowed a dress from her neighbor, a simple black number that clung to her curves in all the right places, and done her makeup with a trembling hand. Her nerves were shot, her stomach twisted in knots. When she heard the knock at her door, she nearly jumped out of her skin. She opened it to find Caleb standing there, looking devastatingly handsome in a tailored suit. He held out a single red rose, his smile equal parts charming and disarming. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Thanks," she mumbled, feeling her cheeks flush. He led her down to another sleek black car, different from the one he'd driven yesterday, and they sped off into the city. She had no idea where they were going, but when they pulled up to a glittering high-rise and the valet opened her door, her breath caught in her throat. "This is fancy," she said, trying not to gawk as they entered the building. "You deserve the best," he said simply, placing a hand on the small of her back as they stepped into the elevator. The restaurant was on the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and expensive wine. As they sat down at a table set with crystal glasses and silver candlesticks, Emilia felt completely out of her depth. But Caleb, as always, seemed perfectly at ease. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, glancing around. "I wanted to," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. The evening unfolded like something out of a dream. They laughed, talked, and for a while, Emilia felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. But when the dessert arrived, a decadent chocolate soufflé, Caleb set his fork down and leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice low. Her heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I wasn't completely honest with you," he said, his gray eyes searching hers. "About what I do. About who I am." She frowned, her stomach twisting. "What are you talking about?" "I'm not just in real estate," he admitted. "I own one of the largest development firms in the country. Let's just say I'm not hurting for money." Emilia stared at him, her mind reeling. Of course. The car, the suit, the restaurant, it all made sense now. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want it to change things between us," he said, his tone earnest. "I didn't want you to think that I was trying to buy your forgiveness, or anything else. I just wanted to see you, to be with you." Her chest tightened, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over her. She didn't know whether to feel angry, flattered, or something in between. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized one thing for certain. Caleb Sterling was no longer just the boy she used to know. He was something else entirely. And whether she liked it or not, her life was about to change forever. Emilia's fingers gripped the edge of the table as she stared at Caleb, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The low hum of conversation and the soft strains of the string quartet around them faded into the background. All she could hear was the rush of blood in her ears and Caleb's words reverberating in her mind. "I own one of the largest development firms in the country." "Why?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you tell me right away?" He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the pristine white tablecloth, his expression raw and unguarded. "Because I was afraid you'd look at me differently, that you'd shut me out before I had a chance to explain." "Explain what, Caleb?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "That you've been living in a world I can't even imagine while I've been scraping by trying to survive? That you've got more money than I'll probably ever see in my lifetime? But you didn't think that was worth mentioning? It's not about the money, he said quickly, his voice firm but imploring. That's not why I wanted to see you again. Emmy, I didn't come back into your life to flaunt what I have. I came back because I missed you. Because I've never stopped missing you. The sincerity in his voice made her chest ache, but it didn't erase the sting of his omission. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. You should have told me from the start. I don't care how much money you have, Caleb. I care about honesty. I know, he said, his eyes pleading. And you're right. I should have told you. But I need you to understand something. I've spent the last 12 years building a life I thought I wanted. Success, power, everything I thought would fill the void. But none of it mattered, Emmy. None of it felt real without you. Her breath hitched at the raw emotion in his voice. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself lean into the warmth of his words, the way he looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. But a part of her couldn't shake the fear that she was just a novelty to him. A reminder of a simpler time. Something he could indulge in now that he had the means to do so. I don't know, Caleb, she murmured, lowering her gaze to the untouched dessert between them. This is all a lot. I need time to think. He nodded, his jaw tightening as if the words physically pained him. Take all the time you need. Just don't shut me out completely, please. The vulnerability in his voice made her stomach twist, but she forced herself to stand, smoothing the borrowed dress over her hips. Thank you for dinner, she said, her voice quieter now. I should go. I'll take you home, he offered, standing as well, but she shook her head. I need to walk, she said, grabbing her coat. She didn't give him a chance to argue before turning and heading for the elevator, her heart thundering in her chest. The rain had stopped by the time she stepped out onto the street, but the air was still damp and heavy. As she walked, the city lights blurred around her, her thoughts spiraling in 1,000 directions. She didn't know what to make of Caleb, of the man he'd become, of the life he now lived. He had always been larger than life to her, even as a boy, but now he felt almost untouchable, like a figure from a different world. And yet, the way he'd looked at her tonight, the way he'd spoken her name like it was something sacred, made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, the boy she'd loved was still in there somewhere. By the time she reached her apartment, she was drenched in uncertainty. She climbed the stairs slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion. When she reached her door, she found a small velvet box sitting on the worn welcome mat. Her breath caught as she picked it up, her fingers trembling. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, the kind of thing she would never have been able to afford in a million years. A small note was tucked beneath it, written in Caleb's unmistakable handwriting. For old time's sake. You always said silver was your favorite. Her heart clenched as she stared at the bracelet, the gesture so thoughtful it made her want to cry. She slipped it onto her wrist, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth blooming in her chest. The next morning, Emilia was startled awake by a knock at her door. Groggy and still in her pajamas, she opened it to find a courier holding a large envelope with her name on it. This is for you, he said, handing it over before disappearing down the hall. Confused, she ripped open the envelope and pulled out a sleek stack of papers. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents, a rental agreement for a new apartment. Not just any apartment, but one in a luxurious building on the other side of town. The kind of place she'd only ever seen in movies. There was another note attached, just 3 words this time. You deserve better. Her hands trembled as she stared at the papers, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over her. Anger, gratitude, confusion. She didn't know whether to scream at Caleb for overstepping or cry at the sheer generosity of it all. Before she could decide, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Meet me tonight. Same place, 7 o'clock. Please. She knew it was him. And despite every logical part of her brain screaming at her to stay away, she found herself typing a single word in response. Okay. That evening, as the elevator doors opened to the top-floor restaurant, Emilia stepped out to find Caleb waiting for her. But this time, he wasn't alone. A group of sharply dressed men and women stood behind him, their eyes sharp and assessing. Caleb's expression softened as he saw her, but the tension in the air was palpable. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between him and the others. "I wanted you to meet my team," he said, his voice calm but firm. "They're part of the reason I left all those years ago. And they're the reason I'm here now." Her stomach dropped as she realized what he was saying. Whatever had driven Caleb away all those years ago, whatever had kept him from her, it wasn't just about him. It was bigger than that, bigger than both of them. And as she looked into his eyes, she realized that she was standing at a crossroads. She could walk away, leave Caleb and his complicated world behind. Or she could take a leap of faith and step into the unknown, trusting that the boy she'd once loved and the man he'd become was worth the risk. "Emilia," Caleb said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to know something. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm just asking you to let me be part of your life, to let me show you that you're worth everything to me." Her breath caught as he stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, equal, parts comforting and terrifying. And in that moment, with the city lights glittering around them and the future hanging in the balance, Emilia realized that she had a choice to make. One that would change everything. "Caleb," Emilia's voice faltered as his fingers brushed hers, his touch as steady as hers was trembling. The weight of his gaze pinned her in place, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. He was offering her a piece of his world, one that glittered with wealth and power, but came with shadows she couldn't yet see. Could she really step into that world? Could she trust him after everything? "I don't know if I belong here," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of her own insecurities. "You belong wherever you want to be," he said softly, his gray eyes holding hers with a quiet intensity. "And if it's with me, I'll make damn sure you never doubt that again." Before she could respond, one of the sharply dressed men standing nearby cleared his throat, shattering the fragile intimacy of the moment. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Emilia noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked to the group behind him like he was bracing for a fight. "I think we're done here," Caleb said curtly, his voice a razor's edge as he turned to face them. "I'll handle the rest on my own." "Sir," one of the men began, but Caleb cut him off with a sharp glare that could have frozen fire. "I said we're done. Go." The group hesitated for a moment, exchanging uncertain glances, but the authority in Caleb's tone left no room for argument. One by one, they filed out, leaving Emilia and Caleb alone in the private dining room once more. "What was that about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "It's business. It doesn't matter." "It looked like it mattered," she pressed, her brow furrowing. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" "No," he said quickly, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "It's nothing you need to worry about, I promise." "Caleb," she began, but he stepped closer, his hands gently cupping her face, silencing her with the sheer intensity of his presence. "Emilia," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've kept things from you. But when I say I want you in my life, I mean it. All of it. The good, the bad, the messy. You're the only thing that's ever felt real to me, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Her heart thundered in her chest, the sincerity in his words threatening to undo her completely. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that the boy she'd once loved and the man standing before her now could be the same person. But the fear of being hurt again still lingered, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "You have this whole other life, Caleb. How am I supposed to fit into that?" "You don't have to fit," he said fiercely, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't realized were falling. You just have to let me be part of yours. Before she could think, before she could second-guess herself, his lips were on hers. The kiss was soft and searching at first, like he was asking for permission, but when she didn't pull away, it deepened, becoming something desperate and consuming. It was as if all the years of pain and longing and unanswered questions melted away in that single moment, leaving only the two of them and the fire that still burned between them. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face. "Say you'll give me a chance," he murmured, his voice raw. "Say you'll let me make this right." Emilia closed her eyes, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. But when she opened them again, she saw nothing but honesty and vulnerability in his gaze. No pretense, no games, just Caleb. "Okay," she whispered, "but no more secrets. If we're going to do this, I need the truth. All of it." "You have my word," he said, his voice steady with conviction. She nodded, her heart still racing as he pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. 2 weeks later, Emilia found herself standing on the balcony of Caleb's penthouse, the city sprawling out beneath her like a glittering sea. The past 14 days had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, each one pulling her deeper into Caleb's world. He'd been true to his word, answering every question she threw at him with unflinching honesty, no matter how uncomfortable it made him. She now knew that his rise to success hadn't been as smooth as it appeared from the outside. There had been betrayals, power plays, and sacrifices, things that had hardened him, shaped him into the man he was today. But beneath the polished exterior and the ruthless business acumen, he was still the boy who had once climbed trees with her, who had made her laugh until her sides hurt, who had loved her with a sincerity that had never wavered. And now he was hers again. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Caleb's voice broke through her reverie, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, a glass of champagne in each hand. "Just thinking about how crazy all of this is," she said, gesturing to the sprawling city below. "This place, this life. You." He smiled, handing her a glass and wrapping an arm around her waist. "Crazy can be good," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "As long as you're here with me." She leaned into him, the warmth of his presence grounding her, in a way nothing else ever had. "I still feel like I'm dreaming," she admitted. "Like I'm going to wake up and find out none of this is real." "It's real," he said firmly, turning her to face him. "And I'm going to spend every day proving that to you." Her heart swelled at the promise in his voice, and as he pulled her into another kiss, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of her happily ever after.